Political group power. To understand political groups, it's important to understand the idea of the pluralist democracy. Pluralist democracy is the idea that individuals can find their political strength only in numbers, by joining with like-minded people to get the representation they want. In other words, as we spoke of before when we were talking about the different forms of democracy, political power really comes from groups when we're looking at the United States political system. And so looking at pluralist democracy as a basis for how we can act to get political power, we're going to look at two particular political groups, types of political groups, in this section. The two types of political groups we're going to be looking at are called political parties and interest groups. We'll break them both out separately, but it's important to have them both on one slide just for a minute to point out the differences in the two. Now, the main difference between a political party as an interest group is the goal of the particular group. The goal of political parties, their initial reason for existing, their main reason for existing, is to elect members to the offices. So in other words, you want to get candidates into the office that you're electing for. So your mayoral race, your presidential race, your congressional race, for example. You elect people to these offices in order to control the government. Interest groups, on the other hand, influence what the government does. Their goal is less about actually electing people and more about dealing with the people once they've already gotten there and trying to influence those people who are already elected to do what they want to do as a group. So let's start with political parties. Political parties are organizations that seek to promote their ideas and policies by gaining control of government through the election of candidates for government office. So really we're looking at going back to week 1 where we're thinking about the idea of politics, and all a political party is, it's a group of people, so a party, who are coming together to decide who gets what, where, when, and how. And that's what a political party is really at its core. There are 3 ways that political parties support a democratic government. First thing they do is they link voters and elected officials. Secondly, they link the party members, so people who are actually involved in the political party in different areas of government. And third, they provide opposition and different points of view. Let's look at each of these separately. Number 1, they link voters and elected officials. In other words, a party is going to tell voters what candidates actually stand for. The voter themselves might not know very much about a candidate, but if they can identify that a candidate is affiliated with a certain political party, they may think that they know something about that candidate. And this is simply if you are driving down the road and you see a sign on the side of the road that says, elect Smith for Congress, and it says Democrat number 51 or whatever it is. You think you know something about Mr. Smith because of the fact that it says Democrat at the bottom of his sign. Secondly, we provide a way for voters to hold their officials accountable for what they do in office individually. So if Mr. Smith gets voted in, however we don't like the way that Mr. Smith is performing, then we can hold him accountable by not voting for him again, hence terminating his job after his first term in office. And then lastly, a party provides a way for voters to hold their officials accountable for what they do in office collectively. In other words, not only do we hold Mr. Smith accountable for Mr. Smith's actions, but if Mr. Smith is part of the Democratic Party, then we are going to hold the Democratic Party accountable for Mr. Smith's actions, and voters may be less likely to vote for Democrats if they did not like what Mr. Smith, as a Democrat, did while he was in office. Number 2, parties link party members in different areas of government. So we're looking at overcoming fragmentation, which is created by federalism and separation of powers. If you'll remember, I don't even remember what week it was, but when we talked about federalism, we talked about breaking up the government into, first off, a separation of powers. So we have the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary. And then secondly, talking about having a federal system where you have a national or central layer, a state layer, and a local layer. Well, parties go across all of these. So the first thing that in this particular area the party does is it links party members in all of the branches. So you may have, for example, a Republican in the executive branch as the president, and Republicans in the House of Representatives in the legislative branch. And this party would link these two together because they're part of the same party, even though they're in two different branches of government. Of course, we see this much less in the judiciary, where judicial candidates are far less likely to announce their political affiliations, but definitely we see this between the executive and the legislative, and whole studies on whether or not a split government or government that is divided has a legislative branch or a Congress that is one particular party versus an executive that has another party are subjects of whole studies and books on different, situations that could happen with that. So it's definitely something that is linked between the different branches. Secondly, we're looking at linking party members in all levels of government. So you have the Republican National Committee in the big national central layer. You have the California Republican Party, and you may even have the Republican Party of Oakland. And even smaller than that, you may have the Republican Committee of whatever town you happen to live in. And these are all connected by virtue of the fact that they're all part of the same party. Thirdly, parties provide opposition and different points of view. Basically, what a party does is they look at ideas and policies of those who are in power right now, and then they go and they tear it up. They decide what they don't like about it. They provide the necessary antagonistic relationship that allows the best political ideas and policies to emerge. In other words, they step back, they say, this is what's wrong here, this is what we're opposing, and hence this is our running platform going forward, is how we can fix the thing that is currently broken. You don't often hear politicians saying, everything's working great right now, elect me to be part of the greatness. Normally they're talking about something that they want to fix or a problem that they've seen within the government that they want to address. And so you have this antagonistic relationship that allows for new ideas to constantly come in. Now, this being said, it's important to take note of the idea of partisanship. Partisanship is when you're taking political sides simply for party gain. So this is when you have a Republican standing up in the House of Representatives and saying, I don't agree with what's going on in that Democrat's idea or plan or bill simply because that person is a Democrat. Now, look at this. This is also an antagonistic relationship, but this is not necessarily the healthy antagonistic relationship that we're thinking of when we're talking about providing different points of view and providing opposition. When we're looking at partisanship, it's really just about sticking with your party and against another party simply because of what party you are a part of. So think of that because it's definitely part of political parties when we're looking at them, but not necessarily in this idea of examining ideas for the purpose of changing things for the better necessarily. Now let's talk about different parts of a political party. There's party organization, party in government, and party in the electorate. Party organization is the party itself. It's the system of central committees at the national, state, and local levels. They get together, and their big thing that they do together is electioneering. I'm sure you've heard this topic before, and if not, then you're going to feel very smart the next time you listen to NPR and they throw it around. What electioneering is when the party gets together and they recruit candidates, they nominate them, they decide who are the people that we want on board in our party. Who do we want out there running for office? And what do we want them to talk about? What is their policy agenda? And then we're going to gather up our resources and do what needs to be done in order to get them elected. So who's on the boat? What do they stand for? And how do we get them into office? And what does our party want to represent in that way? There are two phases of party organization. The nomination phase and the election phase. Remember, with political parties, the main idea is you want to get someone elected. So this is the really big push that we're dealing with here. In the nomination phase, first we're dealing with the primaries. You may have seen primary elections before. The purpose of a primary election is really to get all the different parties together to hold an election to see which candidate you actually like. So you may have 2 or 3 or 4 different parties running, and in their primary, they're each running 2 or 3 candidates. And those candidates get winnowed down or winnowed out so that at the end, one candidate emerges as that party's champion. Conversely, you might see a primary election which only has, say, Republicans running in it and no Democrats. And that could be because the Democratic Party has already chosen who they want to represent them in that particular race, and so they don't need to have a primary to decide between the 2 or 3 top candidates. So really we use this and national conventions to figure out who we want to nominate to move forward. Secondly, we have the policy agenda. We want to look at solutions to the problems that are important to our particular party. And we want to say, this is the way that we want to attack those problems. These are the solutions that we want to put forward and that we're agreeing on across all of our different candidacies. So we want to say, this is what we're putting forward as our ideas of how to fix the problem. And when you see Peace and Freedom Party, you're going to know exactly what the policy agenda is for that candidate. Thirdly, we have control of party factions. So we want to make sure that we are looking at all of the different ideas across the party and controlling for which ones actually get into the party platform. Believe it or not, the Republican Party platform doesn't get made extremely easily because there are a lot of different folks who think that there are different ideas within the way that the Republican ideology works of how to fix certain problems. So factions are just groups. Right? So we're talking about controlling for which ones are going to be a main part of the party platform. And you can think, for example, of a party faction like the Republican Tea Party, a group which has certain ideas on how to do certain things, and they are deciding, well, this is how we want to address a problem, and then in this nomination phase, it's up to the party to decide whether or not they want to include that faction's ideas into their party platform, or if they want to go with another faction's ideas or a bigger group's ideas to what they're going to put out as their official stance on a problem. Then we get to the election phase. This is where we get to the get candidates elected part. We organize and we mobilize voters, and it's a full service shop for the candidates. Candidates come in, and the parties help them fundraise. They train them on how to run campaigns. Oftentimes they actually give them professional campaign assistance. They do opinion polls. They do help with different compliance and election laws and all these different things, so that if you're coming in and you're a candidate and all you have is a winning Gavin Newsom smile, you have the machine to come in around you and teach you actually how to be a campaigner, or do the campaigning for you and build a machine around you so that you can just be essentially yourself, enhanced by this team who's going to make sure that you are doing what you need to do in order to position yourself to get elected. Secondly, we have the party in government. These are the candidates themselves. So if a party has a candidate who actually gets elected, so they've done their main part of their job, getting them into office, the job doesn't stop there. Now you have the candidates in office, and what they have to do is govern. Governing is simply controlling the government by organizing and providing leadership in the 3 separate branches. Mostly in the legislative and the executive, like I said, because we're not identifying heavily in the judiciary, but it's really leading on your party's particular agenda and using that to control what the government does in its decision making. So enacting policy agendas, mobilizing support for the party's policy, building coalitions, working with caucuses, for example, within the particular body that you're working with, and also supporting other candidates who may be running within your party. Lastly, we have the party in the electorate, and that's you and me. That's ordinary citizens who have some sort of party identification. We identify with or are attached to some political party for one reason or another. There are a lot of different reasons why you might have a party identification. A lot of folks inherit it from their parents. Their parents are Republicans, and so they grow up and they decide to vote Republican. You may generally support the basic ideology or policy principles of a party. You've read through the Republican platform and you agree with it and you believe that that's something you want to go with. Or maybe you've had a good experience with a certain candidate or a certain person in office who's of a particular party. So your Republican congressman who you have right now is someone who you really trust and you really agree with, and therefore you believe that kind of jumping on the bandwagon with his party is something which you want to do. Important to notice, though, that today, more people consider themselves independents than identify with either major party. That's generally not the way that we think of ourselves as a nation. We tend to think of ourselves as a very heavily two-party country. However, if you were to break it down and say what percent of America is Democrat, what percentage of America is Republican, what percentage of America identifies with a third party, and what percentage of America is independent, taking that poll, you would find out that more people actually consider themselves independents or are registered as declined to state or don't identify with any one particular party than actually attaching themselves to a particular party. And that's going to change the way that the parties act and the way that parties are run, which we'll look at later on. And so we come to an ideal party system, the responsible party model. The responsible party model is that party government, when 4 conditions are met, looks like this. Or here are the 4 conditions that will be met in order for that party responsible model to happen. Number 1, you have a clear choice of ideologies. You know exactly what everybody stands for. You have choices because they're different, and you can choose between one or another and actually get some pull between two, maybe, well, let's just say you have a choice and the things don't look exactly the same. You know what your choices are, and you're free to make one. Number 2, candidates are pledged to implement the ideas. So you know what the ideas are, and you know that if you vote for a particular candidate, that idea is going to be implemented because that candidate actually pledges to do so. Number 3, the party is held accountable by the voters. So in other words, if 1 or 2 gets messed up, that party will not be voted for anymore because that's not what the voters want. The voters want clear choice, they want clarity, they want choice, and they want the candidates to follow through with what they said they were going to do. And number 4, the party has control over the members. You have a member who strays away, a candidate who doesn't do what they're supposed to do, and the party comes and whips them back into shape, brings them back in line, and has some control over what the people who say they're branded with a certain party are going to do and not do. Now, when you have these 4 together, this is actually an ideal party system, and it actually strengthens democracy. Now, I'm not saying that this happens all the time. I'm saying this is the model, this is what we strive for, and this is really what we're looking for in terms of a healthy party system, not only in the United States, but anywhere where parties exist. So let's take a look at the history of political parties in the United States. Very quickly. In the 1790s, we had parties created to organize legislators and to recruit candidates. It had nothing to do with voters and everything to do with joining a club of people who are like you so that when you're trying to figure out how to run for office or whether you should run for office and who you should work with, it was there. It had nothing to do with voter identification. It had everything to do with joining the group of other like-minded individuals who were running for office. 1828, we saw the expansion of voting rights to all white men. So all of a sudden, we have many more voters in the game than we did before. Go back a couple weeks and remember how small the voting population was when we got started. So now that we have to get across to all of these white male voters, we are turning the parties into something which is not only going to attract candidates, it's going to attract voters for their candidates. The Democratic Party was the first one really to do this well. And what they did is they turned their parties into party machines. What that was that we were going to tell people, if you vote in line with our party, then we're going to help you out. We're going to be responsible for you as people. You vote for us, we're going to help you. Oftentimes that meant helping them get jobs, investing financially in the communities and helping raise communities and helping out members of the public, really, financially, so that their people were more likely to be pledged to a certain party or a certain group who they saw was making positive strides around them. Party bosses tend to operate on a system of patronage. So as soon as you got elected into office, then you had more clout, you had more resources, and you would reward the people who were party faithful with jobs, government contracts, that type of thing. That's really where this was born. 1830s, we're seeing the Whigs, later the Republicans in the 1850s, are going to follow this democratic technique. They integrate the masses of the turn of the century, immigrants, into the political process. So as we're opening up the vote, giving it to more people, changing election laws to figure out how we're going to do things, we are now seeing what types of people we have to reach out to. Average voter participation prior to the 1900s actually exceeded 80% in most U.S. elections because people were going out there and pounding the pavement to get people to vote for their parties. The parties were really heavily active in people's lives, trying to give them what they needed so that the people would go out and vote for them. It wasn't just simply vote for me, it was what can I do for you so that you'll vote for me. Now, just to compare this to today we have roughly between 40 to 60% voter participation, voter turnout. 60% is high, and that's like presidential elections. Elections where we're not running for president, maybe 40%. So that's like half of what we're looking at before the 1900s. And that's because the parties really would do anything to win. Buy votes from people, mobilize people who couldn't necessarily vote and have them vote anyway. Have people who are not dead vote, which we saw in some elections where people actually went back and they realized this person actually couldn't have voted because he died 5 years ago. And of course, a lot of voting laws were enacted around that to clean those things up. And so we get to the genealogy of the American two-party system. We have, remember in the beginning, we talked about the Federalists and Anti-Federalists and how eventually they would kind of morph into other parties. Well, that's where we are now. The Federalists became the Whig Party. The Whig Party then kind of morphed and changed its name and became the Republican Party. On the other side, we had the Anti-Federalist Party, which became the Democratic Republican Party. Again, changing a little bit of its ideas, but still keeping it true to, if you think about the idea of what the Anti-Federalists were about versus what the Federalists about, really keeping that core. And then, after the Democratic Republican Party, changing a little bit in response to the Whig Party and becoming what we know today as the Democratic Party. And so really, throughout history, and we did have some shoot-offs, we did have a couple of other little parties here and there trying to come up, but really it was the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists coming all the way through to modern day with little shoot-offs in here and there and little changes to create what we currently have in today's two-party system.